Hi, Peter Salemian. Welcome to the program. A couple days ago, I was watching some videos on YouTube and I came across a video from a person, and in this video, they were trying to explain to people how Christmas does not originate in paganism, and that what we read in Jeremiah the 10th chapter really doesn't mean the modern day Christmas tree today. And of course, they made up a lot of excuses and arguments on why Christmas is not pagan and how Jeremiah the 10th chapter really doesn't mean the Christmas tree. Well, let's go through Jeremiah the 10th chapter and let's go through it in its context, because that's the problem with this person's argument. He takes this out of context and he puts it in the context of Isaiah the 41st chapter, Isaiah 44, and Isaiah 46. It's a different context in those chapters of Isaiah, and he put it in that context and not the context here of Jeremiah the 10th chapter. Now let's go through verse 1. It says, "Hear ye the word of the Eternal that speaks unto you, O house of Israel." Notice who God is addressing. He's addressing the house of Israel. And Israel was not in the promised land at that time. They got taken away between 724 BC to 669 BC. The Assyrians came in with 5 waves of invasions, came in and took the whole house of Israel away and planted them in between the Black and the Caspian Sea. But God here is addressing the house of Israel. Why? Well, we'll get to that a little later on. So he's addressing the house of Israel, not the house of Judah, the Jews, who were still in the land. Now notice verse 2. It says, "Thus says the Eternal, learn not the way of the heathen." God says, don't learn the way of the heathen. Now, we've proven to you time and time again on the Watchman program in our videos that many of the rituals of Christmas, including the day, December 25th, originate with the pagans and their pagan rituals. Let me just read to you this from this article. Is there any connection between the tree mentioned in Jeremiah 10 and the Christmas tree? And it says here, "Indeed, the sun god was understood to have been born of his mother goddess around the time of the winter solstice." Of course, because these people, they observed the signs of the sky, the stars of the heavens, and they, of course, based their life around the stars. And of course, during the time of the winter solstice, this sun god was born, in fact, by the reckoning of various ancient cultures, on December 25th. Evergreen plants and trees were used in this particular worship because they seemed to retain life through the winter months. These customs have continued down to our day in the form of the Christmas tree and decorations of holly and mistletoe. And of course, we've gone through that with you in many of our videos. And as I showed you, and I'll show you this clip right now, even Hollywood knows that Christmas originated in paganism. Take a look at this clip.
Hey, Sheldon, are you and Leonard putting up a Christmas tree?
No, because we don't celebrate the ancient pagan festival of Saturnalia.
Saturnalia?
Gather round, kids. It's time for Sheldon's beloved Christmas special.
In the pre-Christian era, as the winter solstice approached and the plants died, pagans brought evergreen boughs into their homes as an act of sympathetic magic intended to guard the life essences of the plants until spring. This custom was later appropriated by Northern Europeans, and eventually it becomes the so-called Christmas tree.
As you see there from that clip, Jim Parsons rightly explains that Christmas is the ancient pagan festival of Saturnalia and how the pagans brought in the trees into their homes to preserve the life essence of those trees. And this is what the pagans did. And God says, learn not the way of the heathen. Why is that so hard for people to understand? God says not to learn the way of the heathen. All their rituals, all their accoutrements and so on, God doesn't like. And he says in Deuteronomy, the 12th chapter, verse 29 through 31, he says, don't take these pagan heathen rituals. Take those rituals, turn around and worship me in the same way. God says, don't do that. Now, then he says here, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, the winter solstice. The ancient pagans, when they celebrated Saturnalia, they had this celebration because it was the birth of the sun god, and of course they were begging the sun to come back and warm the northern skies once again. Be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for even the heathen are dismayed at them. And it's interesting how today people practice astrology and they base their lives around the alignment of the planets and the stars and their sign. I'm a Aries or I'm a Taurus or whatever. And they base their life around these things. And God says, even the heathen are dismayed at them. Then he says, for the customs of the people are vain. Now that word vain means useless. When you look at the biblical definition, it means trying to put into your hands, trying to grab into your hands a handful of air, which is of course utterly impossible. It's vain, it's stupid, it's useless, God says. The customs of the people are vain. Now God zeroes in on this particular custom, on this one particular custom. He says, for one cuts a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. And here then comes the whole translation part of it all that these people try to use to justify that this doesn't mean a Christmas tree, that it actually means what it says in Isaiah 41, Isaiah 44, and 46. But the context is different. They try to say here that the work of the hands of the workman means a craftsman, and the axe means his tool where he carves an idol out of wood, and he shapes the idol in his own image, and then they, of course, tap in silver and gold plates and set it up in a niche and, of course, worship that idol. But that's a different context. That's in the context of Isaiah 41, 44, and 46. When you look at the history of it in this article, notice what it says here in the Biblical Archaeology Review, September 1991, page 50. It says here, from the biblical references, it appears that Asherah, and you read it in the Bible, there's Baal and then there's Asherah. Baal being the sun god, Asherah being the mother goddess, and the tree is an Asherah pole. And it says the biblical references, it appears that Asherah is referred to in 3 manifestations as an image, probably a statue or figurine representing the goddess herself. And that's what you read of in Isaiah the 41st chapter, Isaiah 44, and Isaiah 46. 2, as a tree, and 3, as a tree trunk. The latter 2 are, in effect, symbols of the goddess. And then this article later on goes, indeed, the phrase under every green tree that you read of in Deuteronomy 12, verse 2, is used a number of times in Scripture to denote a pagan sacred place that is not just trees, but evergreen trees. Jeremiah 10 is indeed talking about the setting up of idols, but what many fail to realize in reading through the chapter is that sometimes trees themselves were set up by ancient pagans as idols. Depending on the exact meaning of the words translated workman and axe in the chapter, a carved idol or an actual tree could be meant. It all depends on the context. But both were cut from the forest, the tree, with stands fashioned to keep them fixed and upright, but still able to be moved and set up anywhere. Both in the ancient world were decorated with silver and with gold and draped with costly fabrics. With tree idols, idolatrous metal ornaments were sometimes fashioned and hung from the branches, which Jeremiah 10 verse 9 could be describing. Yet the verse could alternately be a reference to metal ornaments for a carved idol. Depends on the context. Now notice, the customs of the people are vain. For one cuts a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. That word axe, when you look at Strong's 46:21, the root of that word axe means to hew down. It's not talking about a craftsman carving an idol. It means to hew down, that word axe. And so this workman is a workman that goes out in the forest and cuts down trees. That's the context. Then they bring it indoors. They take a perfectly good evergreen tree, bring it indoors, and then it says, they deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. So they take it out of the forest and they bring it indoors, and then they decorate it with silver and with gold. And they are upright like a palm tree, but it speaks not. They must needs be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil. neither also is it in them to do good. God says, don't be afraid of them. It's just a tree. It's got no real power. And there's a lot of people out there that get all bent out of shape. They understand the truth of the Christmas tree, but they get all bent out of shape when they're near a Christmas tree, and there's no need to be. God says here they have no real power. Then notice verse 8. It says, but they are altogether brutish and foolish. The stalk, now when you look at that word stalk in Strong 6086, it means a tree. The stalk or the tree is a doctrine of vanities. It has no power. It is vain. It is useless. Silver spread into plates is brought from Tarshish, and gold from Uphaz. And notice, the work of the workman and of the hands of the founder. That workman is not the workman that goes out and chops down trees, but the workman that makes silver plates, silver ornaments, and then they take these silver and gold ornaments and place it on a tree, which of course people do today at Christmas time. And so, when you look at the history of trees, this custom goes back to paganism. And of course, we've taken this custom in our modern day today, and we've continued this custom, and we call it a Christmas tree, and we think we're, honoring Christ with these trees. But in reality, it does come from paganism. Its roots is in paganism. We just took it up and called it Christian. And God says, don't do that. And Jeremiah, the 10th chapter, clearly shows that it is talking about the pagan ritual that we call Christmas trees today. And then you notice, back to verse 1, God says, hear ye the word of the Eternal that speaks unto you, O house of Israel. Israel wasn't there. Obviously, this is a modern day prophecy to the modern nations of the house of Israel. And who is the house of Israel today? Read our booklet, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. It is the modern Western nations today. The Jews don't do this, but the house of Israel, they do it en masse. And that's who God is speaking of here. He's talking to the house of Israel, modern day United States, Britain, and her Commonwealth, and he's saying to them, don't learn the way of the heathen, which what the Christmas tree is, the way of the heathen. It is a custom that is vain. This custom of cutting a tree and bringing it indoors and decking it with silver and with gold. That's what the pagans do. And that's how they worship their gods. And God says, don't take that ritual and worship me in the same way. Now, it's interesting that this video says this. In one point of video, it says this.
I would love any anti-Christmas Christian to please explain to me how it is sinful to decorate a pine tree in my living room. What moral law am I breaking? Just because some pagan somewhere may have used something similar as part of a pagan practice, that doesn't mean that is what we are doing.
All right, so this video argues, how is it sinful for me to decorate a pine tree in my living room? Well, it's not. If you do it in August or maybe July, but why do you do it during a particular month, on a particular day, when the pagans did the exact same thing? Why do you do it on December 25th, during the time of the winter solstice, during the time when the pagans decorated their homes with trees, and of course these trees symbolized a pagan god? Why are you doing the exact same rituals? Now, he said, just because the pagans did it doesn't mean that's what we are doing. At least he admits that the pagans did the same thing. But it does matter, because God says, don't take these pagan, heathen rituals, which is what these things are, turn around and worship me in the same way. Now, if you believe the Bible and you believe God, then you would know that God does not approve of him being worshipped with pagan rituals. But really, it's up to you. And if there is no God, well, then you don't have anything to worry about. But there is a God, and he thunders out, learn not the way of the heathen. So to say that Jeremiah, the 10th chapter, doesn't mean the modern day Christmas tree today is just another Bible misconception.